In November 1922, one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries in human history took place in the scorching Egyptian desert. British archaeologist Howard Carter uncovered the virtually intact tomb of the boy Pharaoh Tutankhamun, a find that would captivate the entire world and spawn one of the most enduring legends of the modern age. Within months of opening the sealed chambers that had remained untouched for over 3,000 years, a series of mysterious deaths began to plague those connected to the expedition. Lord Carnarvon, the wealthy aristocrat who financed the dig, died suddenly from an infected mosquito bite. Others followed, deaths by pneumonia, poisoning, mysterious illnesses, and even murder struck down men who had entered the tomb or handled its treasures. The newspapers seized upon these tragedies with sensational fervor, and a legend was born that would echo through the decades: the curse of the pharaohs. This is a story of how Howard Carter's monumental discovery became synonymous with death, and how one man's ambition to unearth ancient secrets may have awakened something far more sinister than he ever imagined. The tale of Tutankhamun's curse cannot be told without first understanding the world of Egyptian archaeology in the early 20th century. By 1900, the Valley of the Kings had become the epicenter of archaeological exploration in Egypt. This barren, sun-scorched valley on the west bank of the Nile, opposite the ancient city of Thebes, had served as the royal necropolis for pharaohs of the New Kingdom from approximately 1539 BC to 1075 BC. The valley contained at least 63 known tombs, though by the turn of the 20th century, most had been thoroughly plundered by tomb robbers throughout the millennia. Ancient Greek writer Strabo and Diodorus Siculus had reported that 47 royal tombs once existed in the Theban necropolis, with only 17 remaining intact in their time. By the early 1900s, archaeologists were convinced that virtually every significant tomb had already been discovered and emptied of its treasures. In 1902, the excavation permit for the Valley of the Kings was acquired by an American millionaire named Theodore M. Davis. Born in Springfield, New York in 1838, Davis had made his fortune as a lawyer and businessman before settling into a life of leisure in Newport, Rhode Island. He was a peculiar man who spent his winters traveling to Europe and Egypt, accompanied by his live-in mistress Emma Andrews, who was actually his wife's cousin. Davis had become fascinated with Egyptology and saw an opportunity to make his mark on history by funding excavations in the valley. Unlike many wealthy amateurs of his era who treated archaeology as little more than treasure hunting, Davis hired trained professionals to conduct the work. He employed a series of archaeologists, including the young Howard Carter initially, followed by Edward R. Ayrton, E. Harold Jones, and Harry Burton. Under Davis's sponsorship, approximately 30 tombs were discovered or cleared between 1902 and 1914, making his excavations among the most important ever undertaken in the valley. These discoveries included the tomb of Thutmose IV, the impressive tomb of Horemheb, and the spectacular find the tomb of Yuya and Chiyu, the parents of Queen Tai. Davis also discovered what he thought were the remains of Tutankhamun's burial in a small pit designated KV-54. This cache contained about a dozen large sealed storage jars filled with pottery, dishes, bags of natron, animal bones, floral collars, and linen bearing texts dated to the final years of the then obscure Pharaoh Tutankhamun. The jars held materials used in the mummification and burial process, what we now know as an embalming cache. Davis was convinced he had found Tutankhamun's actual tomb. In 1912, he published his findings in a book titled The Tombs of Harmhabi and Tutankhamun, using the French spellings and current. In this publication, Davis wrote words that would prove dramatically premature and historically ironic. He declared with finality that he feared the Valley of the Tombs was now exhausted. He believed every significant burial site had been found and that no further discoveries of importance would be made. It was a conclusion that seemed reasonable given the thoroughness of his excavations. His team had systematically cleared debris from the valley floor, explored every visible entrance, and examined countless gullies and side wadis. By 1913, Davis had become disillusioned with the work, frustrated that despite his extensive efforts and considerable financial investment, he had never found a completely intact royal tomb with all its treasures still in place. In 1914, during his final season of excavation, Davis made what would become a bitterly ironic decision. His team was working near the entrance to the tomb of Ramesses VI. clearing the debris-strewn pathway that tourists used to access the site. They had uncovered some ancient workmen's huts built during construction of Ramesses VI's tomb. Beneath these structures, Davis's archaeologists noticed signs that something might lie deeper underground. However, Davis feared that extending his trench further into the valley floor would undermine the tourist path and potentially cause the collapse of Ramesses VI's entrance. He made the practical decision to halt the excavation at that spot to preserve the existing infrastructure. He abandoned the work and soon afterward relinquished his excavation permit. Theodore Davis died in February 1915, never knowing that his team had stopped digging just 6 feet above the entrance to the most spectacular archaeological discovery of the 20th century. The excavation permit for the Valley of the Kings passed to George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. Lord Carnarvon was born into British aristocracy in 1866 and inherited his title and the family estate of Highclere Castle in Hampshire. He was a man of varied interests and considerable wealth. In his youth, he had been an enthusiastic sportsman and a pioneer motorist. In 1903, Carnarvon was involved in a serious automobile accident in Germany. He was driving at high speed when his car hit a pothole and overturned, leaving him critically injured. The accident damaged his health permanently, leaving him with chronic respiratory problems and a weakened constitution. His doctors recommended that he spend the harsh English winters in warmer, drier climates to protect his fragile lungs. Egypt, with its hot, arid climate, became his winter refuge. Initially traveling to Egypt purely for health reasons, Carnarvon soon became captivated by the ancient civilization and developed a passionate interest in Egyptology. He began collecting Egyptian antiquities and expressed interest in participating in archaeological excavations. However, his early attempts at archaeological work were amateurish and destructive. In 1907, working without trained supervision, Carnarvon and his team discovered and seriously damaged an important stone tablet, an incident that illustrated what professional archaeologists at the time called the sin of allowing amateurs to dig. It became clear to Carnarvon that if he wished to make legitimate contributions to Egyptology, he would need to employ a qualified archaeologist to direct his excavations. Howard Carter was born on May 9, 1874, in Kensington, London, the youngest of 11 children in a family of modest means. His father was an artist who specialized in painting animals, particularly horses and dogs for wealthy patrons. Young Howard showed artistic talent and received training in drawing and painting from his father. This artistic skill would prove invaluable in his future archaeological career, as documenting finds through detailed drawings and paintings was essential work in an era before color photography became widespread. Unlike many Egyptologists of his time who came from privileged backgrounds and received university educations in classical languages and ancient history, Carter had no formal academic training. His education in Egyptology came through practical field experience. Carter's entry into archaeology came through family connections. At age 17, he was recruited by the Egypt Exploration Fund to travel to Egypt as a tracer, someone who would make copies of tomb decorations and inscriptions. He arrived in Egypt in 1891 and quickly demonstrated exceptional talent for archaeological drawing and recording. He worked at various sites, including Amarna, Deir el-Bahari, and Thebes, learning excavation techniques and developing his understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization through hands-on experience. By 1899, at the remarkably young age of 25, Carter had been appointed Chief Inspector of Antiquities for Upper Egypt by the Egyptian government, making him responsible for overseeing archaeological work and protecting ancient monuments in southern Egypt, including the Valley of the Kings. Carter's career suffered a significant setback in 1905 following an incident that became known as the Saqqara Affair. A group of French tourists had entered an archaeological site without paying the entrance fee and became involved in a violent altercation with Egyptian site guards. Carter sided with his Egyptian staff, an action that offended the French visitors who had powerful connections. The political pressure that followed forced Carter to resign from his position as chief inspector. For several years afterward, he struggled financially, surviving by selling his watercolor paintings to tourists and working as a freelance archaeological consultant and guide for wealthy visitors to Egypt. It was during this difficult period that Carter met Lord Carnarvon. In 1907, Carnarvon hired Carter to supervise his archaeological excavations. It proved to be an ideal partnership. Carnarvon provided the financial resources and official permits necessary for large-scale excavation work, while Carter brought professional expertise, meticulous methodology, and an intimate knowledge of Egyptian archaeology. Together, they conducted excavations at various sites in the Theban necropolis for several years, making numerous interesting discoveries, but nothing that approached the spectacular find both men dreamed of achieving. Carter became increasingly convinced that one significant prize still lay hidden in the Valley of the Kings, waiting to be discovered. Despite Theodore Davis's declaration that the valley was exhausted, Carter believed otherwise. He had studied the archaeological evidence carefully and noted that while Davis had found objects bearing Tutankhamun's name, he had not found the pharaoh's actual burial. The items from the KV-54 cache were clearly associated with Tutankhamun's funeral, suggesting that his tomb must be nearby. Moreover, Carter had examined the ancient records and noted that Tutankhamun was conspicuously absent from the list of pharaohs whose tombs had been definitively identified. He theorized that Tutankhamun's tomb might have been deliberately obscured or inadvertently buried beneath debris from later construction work in the valley. When Lord Carnarvon acquired the excavation concession in 1915, Carter convinced his patron that they should focus their efforts exclusively on finding Tutankhamun's tomb. However, timing worked against them. The First World War had erupted in 1914, and archaeological work in Egypt was severely curtailed. The concession was formally signed in 1915, but systematic excavation could not begin until after the war ended. It was not until 1917 that Carter could truly begin his systematic search for Tutankhamun. His plan was methodical and exhaustive. He divided the valley floor in the area where he suspected the tomb might lie into sections, creating a grid system. Each section would be excavated down to bedrock, with all debris carefully removed and examined. It was backbreaking, expensive work that required employing large crews of Egyptian workmen to move tons of limestone chips and rubble that had accumulated over 3 millennia. Year after year, Carter supervised the excavations during the winter months, returning each season to continue the search. By 1922, they had worked for 6 seasons without finding the tomb, having moved countless tons of material and spent a fortune of Carnarvon's money, with nothing significant to show for it. The work was concentrated in a triangular area of the valley floor, bounded by the tombs of Ramesses II, Merenta, and Ramesses VI. This area was complicated to excavate because it lay directly beneath the ancient workmen's huts that Davis had noted, and removing these structures would temporarily block tourist access to the tomb of Ramesses VI, one of the most visited sites in the valley. Carter had deliberately left this section until last, hoping he would find the tomb elsewhere and avoid the logistical complications. By the summer of 1922, Lord Carnarvon's patience was wearing thin. The years of fruitless searching had cost him enormous sums with no return. He summoned Carter to Highclere Castle in England and informed him that he could no longer justify the expense. This would be the final season of searching. If they did not find Tutankhamun's tomb that winter, the excavation would be permanently abandoned. Carter was devastated, but also determined. He had one last area to search, the problematic section beneath the workmen's huts. He resolved to focus all his remaining time and resources on that final piece of ground. Carter even offered to fund the season's work from his own limited savings if Carnarvon would simply maintain the excavation permit. But the Earl agreed to finance one more season. Carter returned to Egypt in October 1922 and immediately set his crew to work removing the ancient workmen's huts and clearing the debris beneath them. The work proceeded through late October and into November with the usual careful supervision, but without any indication of success. Then, on the morning of November 4th, 1922, everything changed. One of Carter's water boys, a young Egyptian whose identity has been variously reported, was digging in the sand when he noticed something unusual. He had uncovered a step cut into the bedrock. Carter was immediately summoned. As the workmen carefully cleared away more sand and debris, more steps appeared, descending into the limestone. They found a stairway, and at the bottom of the stairway was a sealed doorway. Carter's excitement must have been extraordinary, but he was also cautious and methodical. He examined the doorway carefully and noticed that the plaster seal bore the necropolis seal the official mark of the royal cemetery. More thrillingly, he found seals bearing the name of Tutankhamun. This was it. After 6 years of searching, after decades of preparation, and a lifetime of work in Egyptian archaeology, Howard Carter had found the tomb of Tutankhamun. However, Carter also noticed something disturbing. The doorway had been opened and resealed in ancient times, indicating that the tomb had been entered, presumably by thieves. How much of the burial had survived? Was anything left at all? Carter faced an agonizing decision. Every fiber of his being wanted to break through that doorway immediately and see what lay beyond. But he knew that his patron, Lord Carnarvon, who had financed the search for so many years, deserved to be present for the opening. With extraordinary self-discipline, Carter ordered his workmen to refill the stairway completely, burying the entrance again to protect it from potential thieves. He posted guards and then sent a telegram to Lord Carnarvon in England with a carefully worded message that he had made a wonderful discovery in the valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact. Carnarvon should come at once. Carnarvon received a telegram at Highclere Castle and immediately made arrangements to travel to Egypt, accompanied by his daughter Lady Evelyn Herbert. The journey from England to Egypt by ship and rail took nearly 3 weeks. During this agonizing period, Carter waited, spending his time making preparations for the tomb opening and presumably lying awake at night wondering what wonders or disappointments might lie beyond that sealed door. When Carnarvon and his daughter finally arrived in Egypt on November 23rd, Carter's workmen quickly re-excavated the stairway. The entire entrance was now fully exposed, revealing 16 steps descending to the sealed doorway. On November 24th, with Lord Carnarvon present, they photographed the seals and then carefully removed the door blocking. Beyond lay a corridor filled with rubble. The workers spent 2 days clearing this corridor, which extended about 30 feet into the rock. At the far end was another sealed doorway, also bearing Tutankhamun seals, and also showing evidence of ancient reopening and resealing. This was both encouraging and worrying. The double entrance suggested the tomb had indeed been robbed in antiquity, but the fact that officials had resealed it after the robbery indicated something significant had been left to protect. On November 26, 1922, the moment arrived that would become one of the most famous scenes in archaeological history. With Carnarvon, Lady Evelyn, and others watching, Carter made a small hole in the upper left corner of the sealed doorway. Hot air rushed out of the opening, air that had been sealed inside for over 3,000 years. Carter held up a candle and peered through the hole into the darkness beyond. Carnarvon, standing behind Carter in the cramped corridor, could contain his anxiety no longer. He called out, asking if Carter could see anything. Carter, whose eyes were adjusting to the gloom and who was beginning to discern the extraordinary contents of the chamber, responded with words that would echo through history. He said simply that he could see wonderful things. In the flickering candlelight, reflected back at him was a glint of gold. Everywhere the light of his candle touched, there was gold and precious objects. Strange animals, statues, and gold, everywhere the glint of gold. When the doorway was fully open and proper lighting arranged, the full magnificence of the discovery became apparent. They were looking into an antechamber approximately 12 feet by 26 feet, and it was crammed with funeral equipment and treasures. There were 3 gilded couches shaped like fantastic animals, their sides carved and overlaid with gold. There were 2 life-size statues of the king in black resin and gold, standing like sentinels on either side of what appeared to be another sealed doorway. There were chests and boxes, dismantled chariots, alabaster vessels, bouquets of flowers, and countless other objects piled in magnificent confusion. The ancient robbers had indeed entered this chamber, ransacking in their search for portable valuables. But Egyptian officials had carefully restored order as much as possible and resealed the tomb. The sheer quantity of objects that remained was breathtaking. The discovery created an immediate worldwide sensation. News of the find spread rapidly through telegraph and newspaper reports. Tutankhamun, previously an obscure pharaoh known mainly to specialists, became a household name overnight. The tomb was unlike anything ever discovered in Egypt. The only royal burial from the Valley of the Kings found with its contents substantially intact. Previous discoveries had yielded magnificent artifacts, but they had all been thoroughly plundered. Here was a complete royal burial with all its magical equipment intended to serve the king in the afterlife. The public fascination was enormous, fed by regular newspaper reports and photographs of the incredible treasures. However, the discovery also created problems. Lord Carnarvon, seeking to recoup some of his substantial investment in the excavations, had granted exclusive rights to photograph and report on the tomb to the Times of London. This meant that other journalists, including those from major international newspapers, were denied direct access to the site. Frustrated reporters had to rely on secondhand information or brief official statements. This situation bred resentment among the press corps in Egypt and led to them seeking any angle for a story, including increasingly sensational and speculative reporting. The stage was being set for the cursed legend to take hold. The excavation of the tomb was a massive undertaking that would ultimately take nearly 10 years to complete. Each object had to be carefully photographed, drawn, cataloged, conserved, and removed. The antechamber alone contained over 600 individual items. Carter assembled a team of specialists to assist with the work, including archaeologist Arthur Mace from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, photographer Harry Burton, philologist Alan Gardner, and conservator Alfred Lucas. The work required infinite patience and meticulous care. Many of the objects were fragile after 3 millennia underground, and some were in danger of crumbling at the slightest touch. On February 16, 1923, with great ceremony and in the presence of various Egyptian officials and invited guests, Carter opened a sealed doorway between the 2 guardian statues in the antechamber. Beyond lay the burial chamber itself, a chamber that had remained sealed since Tutankhamun's funeral in approximately 1323 BC. The room was almost entirely filled by an enormous gilded wooden shrine, its surfaces covered with religious texts and magical symbols. This shrine was the first of 4 nested shrines that enclosed the stone sarcophagus. The sight was overwhelming, religious symbolism and precious materials on a scale no one had imagined possible. But by this time, strange events were beginning to unfold, events that would give birth to the cursed legend. The first hints of supernatural trouble had actually appeared even before the tomb was opened. According to some accounts, on the very day that Carter first discovered the entrance steps, he returned to his house at dusk to find his servants agitated. His beloved pet canary, which he kept in a cage, was dead, but the manner of death was what disturbed him. A cobra had somehow entered the house and killed the bird. To the Egyptian workers, this was an omen of terrible significance. The cobra was a symbol of the pharaohs, the uraeus serpent that adorned the royal crowns, representing the protective goddess Wadjet, who would strike down the enemies of the king. That a cobra had killed Carter's bird on the very day he discovered the tomb entrance seemed to many a clear warning that disturbing Tutankhamun would bring divine retribution. Carter himself dismissed such superstitious fears. He was a rational man of science who had spent his entire career working with ancient tombs and had never encountered anything supernatural. The cobra incident, while unfortunate, was simply a coincidence. Cobras were not uncommon in the area, and a small bird in a cage would be easy prey. There was nothing mystical about it, but to his Egyptian workmen and to many others, it was an ill omen that would prove prophetic. Throughout the early months of 1923, work at the tomb proceeded with excitement and methodical care. Lord Carnarvon remained in Egypt to witness the opening of the burial chamber and the beginning of work on clearing and documenting the incredible finds. He was in his element, seeing the culmination of his years of investment and his lifelong interest in ancient Egypt. Then in mid-March 1923, disaster struck. Lord Carnarvon was bitten by a mosquito. The exact location of the bite has been reported variously. Some accounts say it occurred at the tomb site itself, others that it happened while he was staying at Aswan. Further up the Nile, regardless of where it occurred, the bite itself was insignificant, merely a minor irritation. However, while shaving one morning, Carnarvon accidentally nicked open a mosquito bite with his razor. The cut became infected. In an era before antibiotics, even minor infections could become life-threatening. The infection in Carnarvon's face led to blood poisoning, septicemia that spread through his system. His condition deteriorated rapidly, complicated by pneumonia. Carnarvon's health, already fragile from his 1903 car accident, could not withstand the systemic infection. He was taken to the Continental Savoy Hotel in Cairo, where doctors struggled to save him. His wife rushed from England to be at his bedside. For several days, he fought the infection, but it was a battle his weakened body could not win. On April 5, 1923, just 4 months and 7 days after the tomb was officially opened, and mere weeks after he had witnessed the unsealing of the burial chamber, George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, died. He was 56 years old. The cause of death was officially recorded as blood poisoning progressing to pneumonia, a tragic but not particularly unusual medical occurrence for the period. However, the circumstances of his death immediately sparked sensational speculation. According to various accounts that emerged and proliferated in the newspapers, strange things happened at the moment of Carnarvon's death. It was reported that at the precise instant he expired, all the lights in Cairo suddenly went out, plunging the city into darkness. The power failure was said to have lasted for several minutes before service was restored. Meanwhile, back in England at Highclere Castle, Carnarvon's beloved fox terrier, a dog named Susie that had been his constant companion for years, allegedly let out a pitiful howl, and then suddenly dropped dead at approximately the same moment her master died in Cairo. These accounts, dramatic and spooky though they were, have never been verified and were likely embellishments added by imaginative reporters or invented wholesale. What was verified was that Lord Carnarvon's sudden death, coming so soon after the tomb opening, provided perfect fuel for supernatural speculation. The newspapers, already frustrated by their exclusion from direct tomb access due to the Times' exclusive arrangement, seized upon the death with ghoulish enthusiasm. Reporters began framing Carnarvon's demise not as a medical tragedy, but as a first manifestation of an ancient curse. They dug up old stories and legends about curses associated with Egyptian tombs. They began looking for any death, however tenuous its connection to the tomb, that could be attributed to Tutankhamun's vengeance. One figure who played a significant role in amplifying the curse narrative was Arthur Weigall, a British Egyptologist and journalist. Weigall had previously served as Chief Inspector of Antiquities for Upper Egypt, the position Howard Carter had held before him. By 1923, Weigall was working as a correspondent for the Daily Mail newspaper, covering the Tutankhamun excavations. However, he was among the journalists denied direct access to the tomb because of the Times' exclusivity deal. Frustrated and needing stories to file, Weigall began embellishing his reports with speculation and dramatic flourishes. He was particularly critical of what he perceived as a commercialization and lack of proper reverence in how the tomb was being exploited. Weigall made a statement that would haunt the entire affair. He later claimed that in February 1923, when he witnessed Lord Carnarvon entering the burial chamber for the official opening, the Earl had been laughing and joking what Weigall considered an inappropriately disrespectful manner. Weigall said he turned to a fellow journalist, H.V. Morton, and remarked ominously that if Carnarvon went down into that tomb in such a spirit, he gave him 6 weeks to live. Whether Weigall actually made this prediction, or whether he embellished or invented it after Carnarvon's death to make himself seem prescient, is unclear. The prediction did indeed come eerily close to accurate. Carnarvon died approximately 6 weeks after the burial chamber opening, which only added to the supernatural atmosphere gathering around the tomb. According to some accounts, including statements attributed to Rex Engelbach, who succeeded Weigall as Chief Inspector of Antiquities, Weigall deliberately resurrected old stories about curses and bad luck associated with disturbing Egyptian tombs. When Engelbach and his wife supposedly protested about Weigall promoting these superstitious tales, Weigall allegedly replied with cynical pragmatism, stating that the public would lap it up. Whether this exchange actually occurred or was itself an embellishment, it reflected the reality that sensational curse stories sold newspapers far better than dry archaeological reports. Weigall himself would later claim he did not actually believe in supernatural curses, but rather saw them as metaphorical expressions of the idea that disturbing the dead without proper respect and scholarly purpose was morally wrong. The curse narrative found another powerful advocate in an unexpected source. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the celebrated creator of Sherlock Holmes and one of the most famous writers in the world, had by the 1920s become deeply involved in spiritualism and the occult. In the years following World War I, Conan Doyle had embraced spiritualism with fervent conviction, believing in the ability to communicate with the dead and in various supernatural phenomena. When news of Lord Carnarvon's death reached England, reporters sought out Conan Doyle for his opinion. The famous author, speaking to journalists in New York, solemnly declared that Lord Carnarvon's death had been caused by supernatural forces. According to Conan Doyle, Tutankhamun's priests had created what he called elementals, supernatural guardians or spirits, and placed in the tomb to protect the pharaoh for eternity. These elementals, he theorized, were responsible for striking down those who violated the sacred space. His statements, coming from such an eminent and respected figure, gave enormous credibility to the cursed narrative in the public imagination. The fact that the creator of the most famous rational detective in literature was endorsing supernatural explanations for events added a delicious irony that newspapers could not resist highlighting. Conan Doyle's involvement helped elevate the cursed story from tabloid sensationalism to a topic of seemingly serious discussion. Adding further fuel to the fire was the British novelist Marie Corelli, a best-selling author known for her romantic and mystical works. Shortly before Lord Carnarvon's death, Corelli had written a letter that was published in New York World magazine. In it, she claimed to possess an old Arabic text that warned of dire consequences for anyone who entered a sealed tomb. She wrote ominously that the most severe punishment follows any rash intruder into a sealed tomb. While Corelli never produced this alleged ancient text, and its existence is highly doubtful, her warning seemed eerily prophetic when Carnarvon died soon after. The letter was widely republished and cited as evidence that the ancients had indeed possessed knowledge of protective curses that could reach across millennia. Reporters also claimed that an actual curse inscription had been found in Tutankhamun's tomb, warning of swift death to anyone who disturbed the king's peace. Various versions of the supposed curse were published, with wording such as "Death shall come on swift wings to him that toucheth the tomb of Pharaoh, or they who enter the sacred tomb shall swift be visited by wings of death." These inscriptions were dramatic and terrifying, and they were also completely fabricated. No such curse was ever found in Tutankhamun's tomb. Howard Carter repeatedly stated this fact, emphasizing that while curse inscriptions did occasionally appear in ancient Egyptian tombs, they were extremely rare and none existed in Tutankhamun's burial. But the invented curse made for much better copy than the mundane truth, and so it persisted in public consciousness despite all evidence to the contrary. The curse legend grew as additional deaths occurred. George J. Gould I, an American railroad magnate and financier who was the son of the famous robber Baron J. Gould, visited the tomb in early 1923. Shortly after his visit, he traveled to the French Riviera where he developed a fever. He died on May 16, 1923, just over a month after Lord Carnarvon's death. The press immediately added Gould to the curse's list of victims, suggesting that the fever he contracted had supernatural origins related to his tomb visit. The reality, that fever and illness were common occurrences in an era without modern medicine and antibiotics, and that a man in his 50s traveling extensively was vulnerable to various ailments, was far less dramatic than the idea of an ancient pharaoh's revenge reaching across the Mediterranean to strike him down in France. Arthur Mace, a member of Carter's excavation team and a respected archaeologist in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, had worked extensively in the tomb, helping to clear and document the antechamber and burial chamber. He was British by birth, but had spent much of his career working in Egypt and America. In the spring of 1923, shortly after Lord Carnarvon's death, Mace began feeling unwell. He left Egypt and traveled to England, where his condition continued to deteriorate. He suffered from what was described as exhaustion and respiratory problems. In 1924, Mace retired from active field work due to his declining health. He lingered in increasingly poor health for several more years before dying in 1928 at the age of 53. The official cause of death was listed as pleurisy, an inflammation of the lungs. Some accounts claimed he died of arsenic poisoning, adding a sinister element to his death, though medical records do not support this. Mace's death was attributed by cursed believers to his extensive time inside the tomb and his handling of the pharaoh's possessions. The fact that he died relatively young and from a respiratory condition added credibility to theories about tomb toxins or supernatural causes. However, Mace had struggled with health issues for years before working in Tutankhamun's tomb, and his condition may have been exacerbated by the physical demands of archaeological work in harsh conditions rather than by any curse or even by specific tomb conditions. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed was a radiologist who was invited to x-ray Tutankhamun's mummy after it was removed from its coffins. He never actually entered the tomb itself during the excavation, but was present in early 1924 when the mummy was examined. Shortly after performing the x-rays, Douglas Reed became mysteriously ill. He died on January 15, 1924, at the age of 52, while in Switzerland undergoing surgery. The official cause was complications related to abdominal surgery for what appeared to be cancer that had metastasized. Nevertheless, his death, coming so soon after his involvement with the mummy, was added to the curse's tally. The fact that it merely x-rayed the mummy rather than disturbing the tomb itself suggested that the curse could strike anyone who in any way interfered with the pharaoh's remains, making the threat seem even more far-reaching and inescapable. The death of Prince Ali Kamalfami Bey of Egypt added an element of the exotic to the curse narrative. In July 1923, the young Egyptian prince was shot dead by his wife, Marguerite Alibert, at the Savoy Hotel in London. Alibert was a French socialite and courtesan who had married the prince in December 1922, just as Tutankhamun's tomb was being opened. Their marriage was stormy and marked by frequent violent arguments. On the night of July 10, 1923, after another bitter quarrel, she shot him 3 times. At her trial for murder, she claimed self-defense and was acquitted of all charges. The case was a scandal that captivated London society. The connection to Tutankhamun's curse was tenuous at best. Prince Ali had apparently visited the tomb at some point, though whether before or after his marriage is unclear. Nevertheless, his violent death was seized upon by the press as another manifestation of the curse. The fact that he was Egyptian and that his death involved such dramatic circumstances made for sensational copy. Some accounts suggested that his arguments with his wife had been exacerbated by obsessive fear of the curse after his tomb visit, though this was likely pure speculation designed to create a more compelling narrative. Another alleged victim was Sir Lee Stack, the Governor-General of Sudan and Sirdar of the Egyptian army. Stack had held these positions since 1917 and was a significant figure in British colonial administration in northeastern Africa. On November 19, 1924, he was assassinated in Cairo by a group of Egyptian nationalist students. The attack was politically motivated, part of the growing Egyptian independence movement's resistance to British colonial rule. Nevertheless, because Stack held important positions in Egypt and would certainly have been aware of and possibly visited the tomb site, his murder was also attributed to the curse by those seeking to expand the list of victims. The assassin's weapons were identified through pioneering forensic examination of bullets, making the case notable in the history of criminal investigation. But the political nature of the killing had nothing to do with ancient Egyptian curses. Richard Bethel served as Howard Carter's personal secretary, handling correspondence, maintaining records, and assisting with the administrative aspect of the excavation. He had been intimately involved with the tomb work from the beginning and had spent considerable time inside the burial chambers. In November 1929, Bethel was found dead in his bed at the Bath Club in London. He was only 46 years old. The official verdict was death from heart failure, specifically what was described as circulatory collapse. However, the circumstances of his death were suspicious enough that some speculated about foul play, though no evidence of violence was found. His death was immediately added to the growing list of curse victims. The tragedy surrounding Bethel did not end with his own death. His father, Lord Westbury, was deeply affected by his son's sudden demise. Lord Westbury had never been involved with the tomb excavation and had no connection to Tutankhamun whatsoever. However, on February 20th, 1930, just 3 months after his son's death, the 78-year-old Lord Westbury committed suicide by jumping from the window of his 7th-floor apartment in London. He left a suicide note that made clear he was despondent over his son's death and could not bear the grief. Nevertheless, the curse proponents seized upon the suicide as well, suggesting that the curse had claimed Lord Westbury through his son's involvement, or that the elderly man had been driven to despair by supernatural forces. The situation became even more macabre when, during Lord Westbury's funeral procession, the hearse accidentally struck and killed a young boy in the street. This random accident was also incredibly attributed to the curse by some of the most zealous believers. Joel Wolfe was a British industrialist and investor who had no direct involvement with the excavation, but had reportedly visited the tomb as a tourist. In 1923, he boarded a ship in Egypt to return to England. During the voyage, he developed a fever and died aboard ship. The circumstances of his death, occurring so soon after his tomb visit, and while still in transit from Egypt, made it another compelling addition to the curse narrative. The reality that shipborne infections and illnesses were common in an era before modern sanitation and medicine was overshadowed by the supernatural explanation. Aubrey Herbert, Lord Carnarvon's half-brother, died in September 1923, just months after his sibling. Aubrey had been born with severely impaired vision and had undergone multiple eye operations throughout his life in an ultimately futile attempt to preserve his sight. In 1923, on the advice of a dentist who believed that infected teeth were causing his declining health, Herbert had all his teeth extracted. He died shortly thereafter from blood poisoning that developed as a result of the dental surgery. While Herbert had indeed visited Egypt and was familiar with his brother's excavation work, he had never actually entered Tutankhamun's tomb. Nevertheless, his death so soon after Lord Carnarvon's was considered too coincidental by cursed believers, who added him to the list of victims. The fact that he died from a dental procedure was explained away as the curse finding indirect means to strike him down. The Honorable Mervyn Herbert, another of Lord Carnarvon's relatives, died in May 1929 from what was reported as malarial pneumonia. He had been associated with the Carnarvon family's interests in Egypt and had visited the tomb site. His death at the relatively young age of 41 added another name to the curse's tally, though malaria was an extremely common ailment in Egypt at the time, with the Anopheles mosquito prevalent in the Nile Valley region. Perhaps one of the most tragic and mysterious deaths attributed to the curse was that of Sir Archibald Douglas Reed's nurse. She had cared for the radiologist during his final illness and death. According to various accounts, she reportedly told friends before dying that she believed her patient's death had been caused by supernatural forces from the tomb. Shortly after making these statements, she herself died suddenly. The details of her death are murky and poorly documented, with different sources providing conflicting information about when and how she died. Nevertheless, her supposed belief in the curse and her subsequent death made her a compelling figure in the mythology. As these deaths accumulated, statistical analyses and lists were compiled by both believers and skeptics. By 1929, various newspapers published tallies claiming that as many as 22 people associated with the tomb's discovery had died under mysterious or tragic circumstances. The lists typically included Lord Carnarvon, Arthur Mace, George J. Gould, Richard Bethel, and others with varying degrees of connection to the excavation. The cumulative effect was powerful. When presented as a list of casualties, it seemed impossible to deny that something supernatural was at work. However, these lists were highly selective and misleading. They included people like Lord Westbury, who had never been near the tomb, and Prince Ali Camelfami Bey, whose death was clearly a domestic murder unrelated to archaeology. They included people who died years or even decades after visiting the tomb, at ages that were not particularly unusual for the period. What the list conspicuously failed to mention was all the people intimately involved with the tomb who did not die young or under mysterious circumstances. Most notably, Howard Carter himself, the man who had discovered the tomb, opened it, spent more time inside it than anyone else, and personally handled more of Tutankhamun's possessions than any other person, lived for 17 more years after the discovery. Carter continued working in the tomb until 1932, when the last objects were finally cleared and sent to the Cairo Museum. He then retired from active archaeology. Though he continued working as a collector and consultant, he traveled, gave lectures, and wrote about his discovery. He died on March 2, 1939, at the age of 64. The cause of death was lymphoma, a form of cancer. He had lived to see the world plunge into the approach of another world war, but he had never experienced any supernatural retribution for disturbing Tutankhamun's rest. Lady Evelyn Herbert, Lord Carnarvon's daughter, who had been one of the first people to enter the tomb alongside her father and Howard Carter, lived a long and healthy life. She married Sir Brograve Beecham in 1923 and had children. She remained active in society and occasionally spoke about her experiences at the tomb opening. She died in 1980 at the age of 79, having lived for 57 years after the tomb's discovery without any curse-related misfortune. Sir Alan Gardner, the distinguished philologist and Egyptian language expert who worked on translating the inscriptions found in the tomb, lived until 1963, dying at the age of 84. Alfred Lucas, the chemist and conservator who spent years working on preserving the tomb's fragile objects, lived until 1945, dying at 78. Harry Burton, the photographer who documented every stage of the excavation and took the iconic images that introduced the world to Tutankhamun's treasures, died in 1940 at the age of 60. Dr. Douglas Derry, who performed the autopsy on Tutankhamun's mummy, lived until 1961, dying at the age of 87. When the full picture is examined, including all the people who worked at the tomb, the curse narrative collapses. Of the 58 people present at the official opening of the burial chamber in February 1923, only 8 had died by 1934, 11 years later. This mortality rate was actually quite normal, even low, for a group with an average age in their 50s and 60s living in the 1920s and 1930s. The Weston Expedition House staff who lived at the tomb site throughout the years of excavation all enjoyed normal lifespans. The Egyptian workmen who did the physical labor of excavation, clearing tons of debris and spending countless hours inside the tomb chambers, showed no unusual mortality patterns whatsoever. Statistical analysis revealed that the curse was a myth created by selective reporting and confirmation bias. When someone connected to the tomb died young or under dramatic circumstances, it was attributed to the curse and widely publicized. When someone connected to the tomb lived to an old age and died peacefully, it was not newsworthy and went unreported. The human mind naturally looks for patterns and meaning, especially in the face of tragedy. The cluster of deaths in the mid-1920s, while statistically unremarkable, seemed meaningful because they involved famous people associated with a sensational discovery. So why did the curse legend take such powerful hold on the public imagination? Part of the answer lies in the historical context of the early 1920s. The world had just emerged from the catastrophic First World War, which had claimed approximately 17 million lives and shattered the optimistic confidence of the Victorian and Edwardian eras. The war had introduced industrial-scale killing, poison gas, aerial bombardment, and other horrors that had traumatized an entire generation. In the war's aftermath, spiritualism and occultism experienced a massive surge in popularity. Millions of bereaved families, having lost sons, fathers, and brothers, turned to seances and mediums in desperate attempts to communicate with their dead loved ones. This was the cultural atmosphere into which news of Tutankhamun's tomb emerged. The public was already primed to believe in supernatural forces and communications from beyond the grave. The idea that ancient Egyptian priests had possessed knowledge and powers that could protect their king for eternity across 3,000 years resonated with people who were already convinced that the boundary between life and death was permeable. The cursed legend tapped into existing anxieties and beliefs, finding fertile ground in a society that had been shaken to its core by mechanized warfare and mass death. Additionally, the cursed narrative reflected Western attitudes toward Egypt and the Orient more broadly. Orientalist thinking, which viewed Eastern cultures as mysterious, exotic, and possessed of ancient wisdom and powers that rational Western science could not explain, was prevalent in the early 20th century. Egypt, with its massive pyramids, enigmatic sphinx, and hieroglyphic script that had only been decipherable for about a century, was the ultimate expression of Oriental mystery. The idea that disturbing ancient Egyptian tombs might unleash supernatural consequences fit perfectly with Orientalist assumptions about the mystical nature of Eastern civilizations. There was also a subtle moral dimension to the curse narrative. Egyptology in the 1920s was largely a colonial endeavor. British and French archaeologists, backed by wealthy patrons and supported by colonial administrations, were excavating and removing vast quantities of artifacts from Egypt. These treasures were shipped to museums in London, Paris, New York, and other Western cities, where they became centerpieces of collections that drew millions of visitors. The excavation of tombs particularly royal burials, involved disturbing human remains and removing grave goods that the ancient Egyptians had believed were essential for the deceased's journey through the afterlife. Many observers, including Arthur Weigall, felt uncomfortable with what they perceived as glorified grave robbing. The fact that Western archaeologists were making their reputations and fortunes by excavating Egyptian burials raised ethical questions. The cursed narrative provided a kind of cosmic justice, suggesting that those who disturbed the dead for personal gain would face supernatural punishment. It was a morality tale that resonated with people who felt that there was something fundamentally disrespectful about the whole enterprise of tomb excavation, regardless of its scientific and historical value. The Egyptian authorities and people themselves had mixed feelings about the excavations. On one hand, the discoveries brought international attention and tourism revenue to Egypt. The treasures of Tutankhamun became a source of national pride and identity. On the other hand, there was resentment that foreign archaeologists were excavating Egyptian heritage sites, and that so many artifacts ended up in foreign museums rather than remaining in Egypt. The cursed legend became, in some ways, an expression of Egyptian agency and power in a situation where Egypt was still under British colonial influence. Even if Egyptians could not prevent the excavations, the idea that the pharaohs themselves could exact revenge provided a kind of symbolic resistance. Media sensationalism played an enormous role in creating and perpetuating the cursed legend. Newspapers in the 1920s operated in an intensely competitive environment. The rise of mass literacy in urban populations had created huge markets for daily newspapers, and publishers competed fiercely for readers. Sensational stories sold papers far better than dry, factual reporting. The Times of London's exclusive arrangement with Lord Carnarvon had created enormous frustration among other journalists who needed to file stories about the most exciting archaeological discovery of the century, but were denied direct access to information. These frustrated reporters turned to any angle they could find to create compelling stories. The cursed narrative provided perfect material. It allowed journalists to write dramatic, frightening articles that captivated readers without requiring direct access to the tomb or official statements. Every death, every accident, every misfortune that could be even tangentially connected to Tutankhamun became front-page news. Reporters were not above embellishing details, inventing cursed inscriptions, or exaggerating the circumstances of deaths to make better stories. The competitive pressure to produce sensational content meant that accuracy and skepticism were often sacrificed in favor of dramatic narratives that would sell more papers. Arthur Weigall's role as both a trained Egyptologist and a journalist created a unique situation where cursed stories gained credibility from someone with professional credentials. While Weigall later claimed he never truly believed in supernatural curses, his early reporting and a supposed prediction of Lord Carnarvon's death helped legitimize the narrative in ways that pure tabloid sensationalism could not have achieved alone. Similarly, endorsements from respected figures like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle gave the cursed narrative an intellectual respectability that helped it spread beyond the tabloids into more mainstream discussion. The cursed legend also benefited from what psychologists call the availability heuristic. Unusual or dramatic events are more memorable and seem more common than they actually are because they are more easily recalled. When Lord Carnarvon died suddenly just months after opening the tomb, it was a dramatic and memorable event that fit perfectly into a cursed narrative. This death became the prototype that colored interpretation of every subsequent death. Even deaths that occurred years later, or deaths from clearly natural causes, were interpreted through the lens established by Carnarvon's seemingly ominous demise. Scientific explanations for some of the deaths and illnesses have been proposed over the years. One theory suggests that ancient tombs might contain harmful pathogens, bacteria or fungi that have remained dormant for millennia and could infect people who breathe the air when tombs were first opened. Aspergillus fungus, which can cause respiratory infections, has been found in some ancient Egyptian tombs. However, medical examinations of Lord Carnarvon and others found no evidence of unusual infections that would support this theory. Carnarvon's infection from mosquito bite was entirely ordinary septicemia, not some exotic ancient pathogen. Another theory proposed the presence of radiation or toxic materials in the tomb. Some suggested that the ancient Egyptians might have deliberately placed poisonous substances in tombs to protect them from robbers. However, extensive testing of materials from Tutankhamun's tomb found no evidence of toxins, radiation, or any other hazardous substances that could account for the deaths. The scientific consensus is clear. There was nothing physically harmful in Tutankhamun's tomb that could have caused a pattern of deaths attributed to the curse. The psychological impact of the curse belief itself may have contributed to some deaths or illnesses. The nocebo effect, the opposite of placebo effect, describes how negative expectations can actually cause or worsen physical symptoms. If someone believed they had been cursed and expected to become ill or die, this psychological stress could potentially exacerbate existing health conditions or make them more vulnerable to illness. However, this explanation is difficult to verify and could only account for a small subset of the deaths, particularly those where the individual had expressed fear of the curse before becoming ill. What cannot be disputed is that the curse of pharaohs became one of the most enduring legends of the 20th century. It spawned countless books, films, and cultural references. Horror films from the 1930s onward featured mummy curses as a standard trope. Boris Karloff's portrayal of Imhotep in the 1932 film The Mummy established a cinematic template of the vengeful resurrected Egyptian priest or pharaoh hunting down those who disturb his tomb. This film and its many successors were directly inspired by the Tutankhamun curse legend and ensured that the story would be passed down to new generations long after the actual deaths had been forgotten. The legend also influenced how future archaeological excavations were approached and reported. Archaeologists working on Egyptian sites in subsequent decades frequently faced questions about curses and had to explicitly address these concerns in their public communications. The curse narrative had become so embedded in popular culture that it was impossible for Egyptologists to ignore it, even as they worked to combat the superstitions with rational explanations and scientific evidence. Howard Carter spent the last years of his life trying to set the record straight about the curse. In his writings and lectures, he repeatedly emphasized that there was no curse inscription in the tomb, that the deaths attributed to the curse were either coincidental or had natural explanations, and that the vast majority of people involved with the excavation had lived normal, healthy lives. He expressed frustration that the sensational curse narrative had overshadowed the genuine historical and archaeological significance of the discovery. Carter had devoted his entire career to the careful, scientific study of ancient Egypt, and he found it deeply frustrating that his greatest achievement had become associated with supernatural nonsense in the public mind. Carter's partnership with Lord Carnarvon had been genuine and productive. Despite the class differences between the self-educated archaeologist and the aristocratic patron, they had developed a real friendship based on mutual respect and their shared passion for Egyptian archaeology. Carnarvon's death had been a personal tragedy for Carter, the loss of a friend and supporter. The transformation of that death into supernatural spectacle must have been painful for Carter to witness. In his writings, Carter showed real anger at the journalists and sensationalists who had exploited his friend's death for commercial gain. The decade Carter spent clearing Tutankhamun's tomb was marked by numerous difficulties beyond the curse speculation. There were bureaucratic conflicts with the Egyptian government over the division of artifacts and the terms of the excavation permit. After Lord Carnarvon's death, there were disputes about who owned the excavation rights and who would finance the remaining work. Carter had a contentious personality and frequently clashed with officials, journalists, and even members of his own team. At one point in 1924, Carter and his team went on strike and shut down the excavation for a period due to disputes with the Egyptian authorities. The political situation in Egypt was also changing. Egyptian nationalism was growing stronger, with increasing demands for independence from British colonial rule. The Egyptian government wanted to assert more control over archaeological excavations and ensure that Egyptian heritage remained in Egypt. The decision in 1922 to designate Cairo Museum as the permanent home for all of Tutankhamun's treasures, with none being sent to foreign museums or retained by the excavation team, reflected this nationalistic sentiment. This decision disappointed Carter and angered Lord Carnarvon's heirs, who had hoped to receive some artifacts in recognition of their family's financial investment. The treasures themselves were beyond magnificent. The golden funerary mass of Tutankhamun, weighing over 22 pounds of solid gold inlaid with lapis lazuli, carnelian, and colored glass, became one of the most iconic images of ancient Egypt. The nested series of coffins, the innermost, which was made of solid gold, demonstrated a level of wealth and craftsmanship that astonished the world. The throne, with an elaborate scene showing Tutankhamun and his wife Enkhsenamun in intimate domestic moments, provided rare personal glimpses of royal life. The chariots, weapons, jewelry, clothing, furniture, and countless other objects filled the Cairo Museum and transformed understanding of ancient Egyptian royal culture. What made Tutankhamun's tomb so special was not the pharaoh himself, but the accident of preservation. Tutankhamun had been a relatively minor king who died young, probably around age 19, after a brief reign of approximately 10 years. He had achieved little of historical significance during his lifetime. His tomb was modest by royal standards, and may actually have been originally intended for someone else and hastily adapted when the young king died unexpectedly. The tomb of Ramesses II or Seti I, had they survived intact, would have contained far greater treasures. But those tombs had been thoroughly plundered in antiquity. Tutankhamun's tomb survived largely intact because it had been buried under debris from the later excavation of Ramesses VI's tomb and was subsequently forgotten and lost until Howard Carter rediscovered it. The irony is that being forgotten and overlooked was what saved Tutankhamun's burial. Had his tomb been remembered and marked like those of more important pharaohs, it would certainly have been robbed. As it was, tomb robbers did breach the tomb twice in antiquity, shortly after the burial, but they were apparently caught or interrupted before they could complete their plundering. Officials restored order to the ransacked chambers and resealed the tomb. Then, when workmen excavating Ramesses VI's tomb tossed their debris down the hillside, they inadvertently buried Tutankhamun's entrance under tons of limestone chips. The tomb vanished from human memory for over 3,000 years until Theodore Davis's workmen unknowingly camped on top of it, and Howard Carter's persistence finally relocated it. The mummy of Tutankhamun himself revealed fascinating information when it was examined. The young king had suffered from various health issues, including a cleft palate, a clubfoot that would cause him to walk with a limp, and probable bone necrosis in his left foot that would have been painful and debilitating. CT scans performed in the 21st century revealed evidence of malaria infection and suggested that the king may have died from complications of a broken leg that became infected. The romantic notion of a curse protecting a powerful pharaoh clashed with the medical reality of a sickly young man who suffered from genetic disorders caused by royal inbreeding, and who died from what was probably a combination of infection and disease. The global fascination with Tutankhamun has never truly waned. When the traveling exhibition Treasures of Tutankhamun toured major museums around the world in the 1960s and 1970s, it attracted record-breaking crowds. Millions of people waited in long lines for hours to glimpse the golden mask and other artifacts. The exhibition generated enormous revenue and sparked renewed public interest in ancient Egypt. Subsequent exhibitions of Tutankhamun artifacts have continued to draw massive crowds wherever they appear. The curse legend evolved and adapted over the decades. As the original deaths receded into history and the survivors like Carter lived out normal lifespans, the curse narrative shifted. Rather than claiming that everyone who entered the tomb would die mysteriously, the modified legend suggested that those who disturbed the pharaoh with insufficient respect, or who profited from the tomb's treasures, or who specifically handled the mummy itself would be cursed. This more flexible version of the curse could accommodate the inconvenient fact that most people involved with the excavation lived normal lives. Modern popular culture has kept the curse alive through films, books, television shows, and video games. The mummy curse became a standard horror trope, divorced from the specific facts of Tutankhamun's case, but drawing on the same basic narrative of ancient Egyptian supernatural revenge. These fictional elaborations often feature mummies rising from the dead, shambling monsters wrapped in decaying bandages, seeking to kill those who disturb their rest. While entertaining, these depictions bear no relationship to ancient Egyptian religious beliefs or to the actual events surrounding Tutankhamun's tomb. The real ancient Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife and tomb protection were far more sophisticated than the crude revenge narratives of the curse legend. The Egyptians believed that preserving the body and providing it with food, drink, and other necessities through offerings and tomb goods will allow the deceased to live eternally in the afterlife. Tomb inscriptions typically consisted of prayers for offerings, lists of titles and achievements, and religious texts like the Book of the Dead that would guide the deceased through the dangers of the underworld. True curse inscriptions, when they did appear, were usually intended to frighten away potential thieves or to ensure that the tomb chapel continued to be maintained by priests. They were administrative and religious texts, not magical booby traps. The question of whether the ancient Egyptians actually believed their curses had supernatural power or whether the inscriptions were simply psychological deterrents is debatable. The magical religious worldview of ancient Egypt did not make sharp distinctions between natural and supernatural causation in the way modern Western thought does. A curse inscription invoking the gods to punish tomb robbers would have been taken seriously by ancient Egyptians who believed the gods were active agents in the world. However, there is no ancient Egyptian precedent for the idea that a curse could lie dormant for 3,000 years and then suddenly activate to kill people who disturb a tomb in the modern era. The ethics of archaeological excavation of human burials continue to be debated. Modern archaeology has developed far more sophisticated approaches to the treatment of human remains, with consultation with descendant communities, respect for religious and cultural beliefs, and careful consideration of whether excavation is truly necessary. Many archaeologists now argue that burials should be left undisturbed unless there is a compelling scientific reason to excavate them. The wholesale removal of mummies from Egyptian tombs to museums around the world, common in the 19th and early 20th centuries, would be considered unacceptable today. In this context, the curse legend can be understood as an early expression of discomfort with colonial archaeology that treated ancient Egyptian burials as objects of scientific curiosity and sources of museum treasures, rather than a sacred human, remains deserving respect. The idea that the pharaohs could reach across the millennia to punish those who disturbed them provided a kind of poetic justice, restoring agency and power to the people whose graves had been violated. Whether one believes in supernatural curses or not, there is something emotionally satisfying about the idea that grave robbers, even scientific ones, might face consequences for their actions. Howard Carter's later years were marked by professional frustration. Despite having made the most spectacular archaeological discovery of the 20th century, he never received the official recognition he felt he deserved. He was never knighted or awarded any significant honors by the British government, a slight that deeply wounded him. This lack of recognition stemmed partly from his difficult personality and his conflict with authorities, and partly from class prejudice. Carter was not university educated and did not come from an elite background. In the class-conscious world of early 20th century Britain, his achievements were somewhat discounted because of his humble origins. Carter spent his final years in London, living in a modest flat in Kensington, not far from where he had been born. He worked as a collector and dealer in Egyptian antiquities, advising museums and wealthy collectors. He gave occasional lectures about the tomb discovery, but was increasingly bitter about how the cursed legend had overshadowed the genuine archaeological importance of the find. He never married and had no children. When he died in 1939, his funeral was a modest affair attended by only a handful of mourners. The man who had discovered the tomb of the century died relatively forgotten, eclipsed by the sensational curse narratives that he had spent years trying to debunk. The treasures of Tutankhamun remained in Cairo Museum, where they became the institution's premier attraction. The golden mask was displayed in a climate control case and became perhaps the single most photographed artifact from the ancient world. After Egypt gained full independence from Britain, the treasures became symbols of Egyptian national identity and pride. President Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 1950s and 1960s invoked Egypt's pharaonic past as part of his nationalist ideology, and Tutankhamun's treasures served as tangible evidence of Egypt's ancient greatness. In the 1970s, the Egyptian government made the strategic decision to send a selection of Tutankhamun artifacts on a world tour. This was partly a diplomatic initiative to improve Egypt's international relations, partly a cultural exchange, and partly a financial venture as the exhibitions generated substantial revenue. The tour was phenomenally successful, attracting unprecedented crowds to museums in cities across the United States, Europe, and Asia. The lines to view the treasures sometimes stretched for city blocks, with people waiting 4 or 5 hours for admission. The exhibition sparked Tutmania, a popular culture phenomenon with Tutankhamun imagery appearing on everything from T-shirts to lunchboxes. In 1972, when the treasures were exhibited at the British Museum in London, it must have seemed like a homecoming of sorts. the artifact returning to the city where their discoverer had lived and died. The exhibition attracted over 1.6 million visitors over 9 months, making it one of the most successful exhibitions in the museum's history. The British public's fascination with Tutankhamun, 50 years after the tomb's discovery, demonstrated that the allure of ancient Egypt and the boy king had not diminished with time. The cursed legend itself has been examined by folklorists, psychologists, and historians as a case study in how modern myths are created and perpetuated. It demonstrates the power of narrative to shape public perception of events, even in contradiction to factual evidence. The cursed story has all the elements of an effective narrative: mysterious ancient wisdom, transgression and punishment, dramatic deaths, supernatural forces beyond human control, and the suggestion that there are powers in the world that science cannot explain. These narrative elements prove more compelling to the public imagination than the mundane reality of coincidental deaths from natural causes. The curse also served various psychological and cultural needs. For a public traumatized by the First World War and facing an uncertain future in the 1920s, the idea that ancient powers could reach into the modern world provided a kind of dark reassurance that there were forces and meanings beyond the mechanized carnage of modern warfare. The curse offered a return to a pre-modern worldview where supernatural forces actively intervened in human affairs, a worldview that many found emotionally comforting even if intellectually they knew better. For Egyptians, the curse legend provided a narrative of resistance and power during a period when Egypt was still dominated by British colonial authority. Even if Egyptians could not prevent British archaeologists from excavating their ancestral tombs, the pharaohs themselves could exact revenge. This gave a kind of symbolic agency to Egyptian heritage that was otherwise being controlled and appropriated by foreign powers. The curse became a tool of anti-colonial resistance in the realm of imagination and cultural narrative. The media's role in creating and sustaining the curse legend cannot be overstated. Newspapers in the 1920s discovered that cursed stories sold papers far better than dry archaeological reports. Every death, every accident, every misfortune that could be even tangentially linked to the tomb became headline news. Journalists competed to find new victims of the curse and to uncover ever more sensational details. The exclusive arrangement between Lord Carnarvon and the Times of London, which denied most journalists direct access to information about the excavation, perversely fueled curse speculation as frustrated reporters turned to supernatural narratives when factual reporting was impossible. The invention of the supposed curse inscription, "Death shall come on swift wings to him that toucheth the tomb of Pharaoh," demonstrates how fictional elements could be seamlessly integrated into the curse narrative and then be repeated so many times that they became accepted as fact despite having no basis in reality. Even today, many people believe this inscription was found in Tutankhamun's tomb, when in fact it never existed. This shows how powerful media narratives can override factual evidence when they provide more emotionally satisfying or dramatically compelling story. The scientific investigation of the curse legend by researchers in subsequent decades has been thorough. Studies have examined the mortality rates of people connected to the tomb, comparing them to expected mortality rates for similar populations. These studies consistently find no statistical anomaly. The people who worked at or visited Tutankhamun's tomb died at rates entirely consistent with the general population of similar age and social class in the 1920s and 1930s. Some died young from accidents or illnesses, as people did then and still do now. Most lived normal lifespans. There is no evidence of any pattern that would require supernatural explanation. Medical examinations of the tomb environment itself have found no hazardous pathogens, toxins, or radiation that could account for illnesses or deaths. The speculation about ancient bacteria or fungi in tombs has been investigated, and while some ancient Egyptian tombs have been found to contain potentially pathogenic organisms, Tutankhamun's tomb was not one of them. The tomb was remarkably clean and well-preserved, with no unusual biological or chemical hazards. People who spent hundreds of hours working inside the tomb chambers suffered no ill effects whatsoever from the environment. The curse of the Pharaoh stands as one of the great myths of the modern age, a legend that emerged at the intersection of archaeological discovery, colonial politics, media sensationalism, and post-war spiritual seeking. It transformed the greatest archaeological find of the 20th century into a supernatural horror story. It overshadowed the genuine historical significance of discovering an intact royal burial and learning about the life, death, and burial practices of ancient Egypt. It turned Howard Carter's lifelong dedication to careful scientific archaeology into a tale of grave robbery punished by ancient vengeance. Yet for all its factual inaccuracy, the cursed legend touched something deep in the human psyche. It spoke to our sense that some places and things should remain undisturbed, that the dead deserve respect, that there are mysteries in the world beyond our understanding. It provided moral meaning to what might otherwise have seemed like random tragedies. It gave a kind of power back to people whose graves have been violated, even if that power was only imaginary, and it ensured that the name of Tutankhamun, an obscure boy king who ruled briefly and died young over 3,000 years ago, will become one of the most famous names in all of history. Howard Carter died without ever seeing the cursed legend fade away. It was still being discussed in newspapers, still influencing popular perceptions of his work, still overshadowing the scientific achievements of the excavation. In the decades since his death, the legend has only grown and evolved, taking on new forms in films, books, and popular culture. The curse has become immortal in a way that the pharaoh it supposedly protects never could be. The truth, prosaic as it may be, is that Tutankhamun's tomb contained no curse. The deaths attributed to supernatural causes were simply the normal mortality of human life in an age before antibiotics and modern medicine. Lord Carnarvon died from an infected mosquito bite, a tragedy that could have befallen anyone in Egypt in 1923. Arthur Mace died from respiratory illness that had troubled him for years. Richard Bethel died from heart failure, at an age when such deaths were not uncommon. The others died from illnesses, accidents, and violence that had nothing to do with 3,000-year-old curses. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the curse legend is that despite overwhelming evidence that is false, despite decades of debunking by archaeologists and historians, despite statistical analyses showing no unusual mortality patterns, the legend persists. People want to believe in the curse. It makes for a better story than the truth. It adds drama and mystery to archaeological discovery. It suggests that the ancient world still has power over the modern world, that there are limits to human knowledge and control. In an age of science and rationality, the curse legend offers a tantalizing glimpse of the irrational and supernatural. So the curse of the pharaohs lives on, not in any supernatural reality, but in the realm of myth and legend where it has always truly resided. Tutankhamun, the forgotten boy king whose tomb was nearly lost to history, became in death far more famous than he ever was in life. Not because of any curse he laid upon his tomb, but because Howard Carter never gave up searching, and because the human imagination will always prefer a good story to a prosaic truth. What do you think of the curse of the pharaohs? Was it a genuine supernatural phenomenon, or merely a combination of coincidence, media sensationalism, and human psychology? Leave a comment below with your thoughts. Subscribe to the channel and give it a like. Until the next story,